Judas, Portrait of a Covert Narcissist. When it comes to understanding pathological narcissists, whether covert or overt, the Bible is a treasure trove of information. No other source can surpass the insight we can get from God's Word. Yes, the Bible seems to place a spotlight, a magnifying glass on narcissists and makes a point of emphasizing God's great displeasure with narcissism of all types. In fact, the attitudes God calls out most as displeasing to him just about describe every trait of a narcissist. Yes, the narc has gone fully against God in their attitude towards life. They pay God no heed and simply do as they please. Lying, backbiting, bearing false witness, doing any foul act that they can get away with and showing no conscience, guilt, or remorse is all very displeasing to God, and he specifically lists these traits as an abomination to him. Yes, the haughty attitude of the narc and their lies are all considered the worst characteristics a human being could portray according to the Bible. The narc may give lip service to God, but their actions, which extend to the incredible immoral and lax standards that some narcs allow for their children, shows a complete lack of concern or acknowledgement that God even exists. Not all narcs raise their children this way, but a select few do, and they allow their children license to do things that would give even most secular people pause. The laws of God are written upon each person's conscience, but the narcissist either lacks a conscience or has ignored their conscience over the course of their lifetime, and therefore their conscience became calloused and then seared. So without a conscience, even a church-going narc is actually much less moral than an atheist that follows their conscience when it comes to raising children, or in other conduct. The atheist at least does the right thing, even if for the wrong reasons or motivations, and as such is at least living by honest standards. The atheist is true to themselves and a coherent, sane human being. This is not the case for the narcissist. The narc is never what they appear and has no integrity in the real sense of that word. The narc is a disintegrated person, for lack of a better word, because the narc has a total disconnect between who they are internally and who they appear to be. Yes, an atheist can be a decent person, and even many narcs at least love their children enough to not allow them to cultivate lying and other lascivious activity. But the immorality of modern society has given a select few narcs some very novel ideas about child rearing, and these narcs take those standards to a new level. This is the sad state of affairs when a person not only has a total lack of concern with regard to standards of decency as outlined by the Bible, and on top of that doesn't even have a conscience to govern them. Yes, God's opinion doesn't matter, the narc knows better, and no, a conscience is a quaint idea, but the narc is evolved and has freed themselves of the troubling and burdensome codes of common decency. The narc creates their own standards because they are above it all, and on top of that it gives them license to do as they please. The bottom line here is, when you combine a lack of conscience with a lack of concern for God's opinion, you actually create a behavior pattern, an attitude that is what an outside observer would describe as narcissism. So in a real sense, we have just put our finger on the two most important cures for narcissism if a narc would ever want to help themselves. 1. The narc would have to do everything in their power to begin awakening and growing their conscience, and 2. A narc would have to begin giving God proper respect and begin at least acknowledging that God exists and beginning the long journey to try to live according to God's will. Yes, religious narcissists exist, but these religious narcissists do their own will and disregard what God wants, even though they have convinced themselves they are doing God's will. The Apostle Paul is a perfect example of a religious zealot who was actually a narcissist doing his own will. Jesus confronted Paul, and this resulted in Paul's conversion and cure from narcissism.
Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?
Who art thou, Lord?
I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks.
Lord, what wilt thou have me to do?
Arise, and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do.
Paul's will was now in line with God, and that made all of the difference. Yes, the cure for narcissism, as shown by the conversion of the Apostle Paul, is Jesus. So now we cover the sad case of a covert narcissist. A person who thought themselves clever and was deluded into thinking they were getting away with everything. A person who thought of no one but themselves and thought they had all of the angles covered. A person who enjoyed putting on an act and deceiving others, and this bolstered their pride even further. Yes, getting away with lies can be addictive, and yes, it creates confidence, but it is a false confidence, the false confidence of all narcissists. Yes, when a person is dedicated to lying to the extent that a narc is, they begin to believe they have control of everything. Yes, the narc believes everything is in the palm of their hand. That very notion is absurd, but the narc is too drunk on themselves to see it. Yes, the narc has pulled off one ruse after another, but in the end they have missed the big picture and have deceived themselves. The narc has lost sight of what is important in life and missed the opportunity that life presented them. The narc will never have peace and joy. Think about the ignorance of a person who can't even see why being truthful and presenting yourself honestly is simply a more efficient and more practical way of living life than the ridiculous attitude of the narcissist. The narc sees the low-hanging fruit, sees opportunities, and can never understand why people don't take those opportunities. The answer is that people have a moral compass, and a person who engages in moral behavior, whether they are secular atheists or religious, intuitively understands why you don't simply do something because you can get away with it. So the narc's ignorance is fully visible to anyone who takes notice, and the narc, being aware of this, takes great pains to do everything in secret, covertly. But the narc never covers all of the angles as they think they are doing, and in the end the narc's motives and actions are fully exposed in the light. Yes, in an effort to blind others, to pull the wool over other people's eyes, the narc has blinded themselves. The victims, which stack up during the course of a narcissist's life, may never see justice, and to them the narc simply goes on with their evil ways and somehow never has to pay. But sometimes the victim just has to understand that their encounter with a narcissist has presented them with a challenge. The challenge is to let go, not seek vengeance, and leave it all with God. The problem the narc gives the victim is a huge burden that requires huge amounts of effort to overcome, but in the end a victim can find their way back to peace and back to joy. So the story of Judas is especially important for a victim to hear, since the sad end of a covert narcissist is plainly laid out in front of us, and that end is very tragic. We must leave that narcissist in God's hands, and if we can fully comprehend the danger that narc is in, we should try and pray for those poor creatures. Yes, the narc will pay, and pay with interest. Yes, Judas spent 3 years pretending to be a follower of Christ. He put on the perfect show and no one suspected him. Yes, the other 11 apostles, when told one person among them would betray Jesus, Judas was never even suspected. An outsider would have never seen Judas as the betrayer. No, Judas didn't have beady eyes or seem like a dishonest person with something to hide. Judas may well have looked like the kindest and most sincere and most caring, as well as the most devoted of the 12 disciples. So we move on to John 13:21-29. Yes, Jesus said one of them would betray him, and he even made note that the one he gives the bread to is that person, but the disciples witnessing this still couldn't see Judas as the betrayer. Then Jesus told Judas, "Do what you must do quickly." So Judas understood that Jesus knew everything, but nothing would stop Judas with his encounter with destiny. Yes, by then Satan had entered Judas. That and his self-deluded sense of himself meant that there was almost nothing that could stop him from proceeding with the betrayal. So now we will focus more closely on the sad case of Judas. Jesus was never deceived about Judas. We see this in John 6:64, but there are some of you that believe not. For Jesus knew from the beginning who they were that believed not, and who should betray him. Then Jesus became more specific and made mention of one of the apostles being a devil, as stated in John 6:70. Jesus answered them, "Have not I chosen you 12, and one of you is a devil?" Judas was present for all of it, and yet somehow he was convinced that he could get away with his deception. Yes, Jesus was aware from the start, and yet he purposely put Judas in charge of the money. Yes, clever Judas had his hand in the till, stealing from the funds, and really believed he was getting away with it. Judas was so wrapped up in himself and his overconfidence in his abilities to deceive that he was totally blind to the fact that he was following God in human flesh. Judas never put together the pieces that Jesus saw it all, and it wouldn't have taken that much effort or logic to realize it, being that Judas witnessed all of Jesus' abilities firsthand. But Judas couldn't see the obvious because he was too focused on deceiving. Yes, Judas put on the perfect act, deceiving every one of his fellow apostles. So when the final hour was approaching, Jesus mentioned that one of the apostles would betray him, as stated in Matthew 26:21, and while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." Then one after another of the apostles asked, "Is it me?" Now let's listen to Matthew 26:25, then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." Jesus answered, "You have said so." So Judas and the disciples were told point blank it would be Judas, but even then the apostles couldn't believe Judas was the betrayer. That is how good a show Judas made of his piety. More importantly though, even Judas, when told to his face Jesus knew he was the betrayer, still believed he would get away with everything and prevail. That is how self-deluded and irrational the narcissist gets. They can't see reality and truth right in front of their face. They have spent so much time, put in so much effort and devotion to deception, that the narc becomes self-deluded, never realizing that they are deceiving themselves. But the story of Judas is much worse than that, and to get more detail we need to go back to the Gospel of John, when Jesus was asked who would betray him. John 13:25-26, leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then, dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Amazingly enough, even after this the apostles couldn't believe it was Judas that would be the betrayer. Yes, a narcissist can definitely put on a show and make people believe they are good, trustworthy people, but God, in this case in the form of the Son, Jesus, is never deceived. So then we get to the biggest part of the tragedy of Judas, the point of no return, as described in John 13:27, as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, "What you are about to do, do quickly." Yes, Satan entered into Judas and he marched to his doom. Yes, even before departing, Judas heard Jesus say clearly in Matthew 26:24, "The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him." But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. Yes, Judas heard that warning, but it made no difference. All of those years of deception had finally caught up with him, and no amount of warning would make any difference, and in the end Judas simply became Satan's instrument, a puppet that had lost all control of his own destiny. Yes, years of putting emphasis on the material while putting on the pretense of spirituality had now put Judas on a collision course with destiny. So Judas got his 30 pieces of silver and gave Jesus that kiss. But there is one more critical piece of information that has to be discussed. Judas had led over 600 people to apprehend Jesus. Let's go to Matthew 26:48-50, "Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, 'Whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him.' And forthwith he came to Jesus, and said, 'Hail, Master,' and kissed him. And Jesus said unto him, 'Friend, wherefore art thou come?' Then came they, and laid hands on Jesus, and took him." So what is the key here? Even after kissing Jesus and betraying him, Judas was still called a friend by Jesus and given one last chance. But Judas was too filled with himself to even see what was being offered him, and more importantly, Judas didn't even care for the last chance Jesus had offered him. We then go to Matthew 27:3-5, when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. Yes, Judas finally felt remorse, but to understand this we need to contrast Judas with Peter, who promised to never deny Jesus or fall away and then denied him 3 times. Peter repented of his failure and was forgiven. Judas was simply unhappy that he didn't get what he wanted for his efforts. Yes, Judas realized that he sinned and realized that his gain wasn't worth the cost. So it is quite interesting to note that Peter, the overconfident, frail, sinful and weak human, failed, and having realized he failed, sought forgiveness and was forgiven for not being perfect. Judas succeeded in his plans, got everything his way, and in getting it his way despite one chance after another to turn around kept going, and in so doing sealed his fate. My thanks to the clear exposition and contrast of Peter and Judas provided by Greg Laurie. Yes, the chickens do eventually come home to roost, and the narcissist will never be able to escape the reality of their terrible deeds. Just like Judas, who was very disappointed and disillusioned after selling out Jesus, that narc got what they wanted and received their 30 pieces of silver, but it was a hollow victory. It came at someone else's great expense, and worst of all, the narc will wish they never got that silver. But it is too late. They wanted it, now they have it, and they can't give the silver back. Here is the difference. The narc is still alive and they still have ears to hear and a mind that thinks. It has been laid out for them, they have been warned. So here is the question, will the narc perceive what happened to Judas and comprehend that they are just as deluded as he was? Will the narc understand the grave danger they are in and understand that they are deluding, deceiving themselves? Will the narc realize that eventually they run the risk of being mere puppets for Satan? Sadly, most narcs will think this is all a joke, a waste of time. The narc doesn't want the truth and loves their lies, but the price they pay for denying reality will be a high one. Perhaps they might also be in a situation where it would have been better if they were never born. They can call on Jesus and they can be saved and all can be forgiven. But how many times can someone get a second chance? Pray for the narcissists, maybe it will help, but maybe it will be a waste of your time. We wish no one the terrible ending of Judas then, or the suffering he will be doing for eternity. Thank you for watching. Comments are welcomed. Peace be with you.
How does it feel to cry? How does it feel to have to hide? Can I help you for a while? Pride, just look me in the eyes. I thought you would be by my side.